There we go.
That's all right.
All right.
Cool.
So yeah, how have you been today?
Tired, quite tired, but I'm still sort of with it. You got me at like 80%.
I know that feeling.
I'll do my best.
All right. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for like taking time out of your day to do this. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. No worries. I hope your project goes well. I can't guarantee I'll add too much insight, but I'll try my best.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much all I need is just opinions, though. Just what you think about the questions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. No worries.
All right. So yeah. I just jumped right into it. First one I have written here is like, what do you like with the new regulation changes coming, like the budget caps and like limiting testing? Do you think that's going to have like as large of an effect as like the FIA are hoping, or like what do you think on that?
I think the FIA have done a smart thing in that they haven't actually publicly given any measurable benchmarks about that. I'm sure they probably have some internal ones that they're kind of hoping for, but we don't actually know how effective they expect this to be, which I think kind of makes sense because they haven't really done this before, especially around cost capping.
Yeah.
They've played with the error and stuff before, but there's like I kind of see this as a first step, and then they see how that goes, and then sort of tweak it, fiddle it, and just. I mean, I think this is the future now. We're keeping an eye on cost caps. We're keeping an eye on how big the teams are and how many resources they're using and stuff. And then from here on out, we're just going to fiddle with that as teams react to it and stuff. And we're still going to see things like teams finding loopholes and finding ways around it the way they have done all the ways. But it is interesting that we've now got this third set of regulations, these financial regulations that are going to sit alongside the sporting and technical regulations as like with kind of equal standing, I guess. So this is definitely a new era moving into, but kind of in a vague sense. If I'm not benchmarking it, I think it's a really hard thing to judge. I think it's not something we're going to sort of see immediately kind of play out in the sport, or like we're suddenly going to see like the small teams that were spunky but never had any cash are suddenly going to shoot up to the top. But I think this is going to sort of cascade through the years and start bringing everyone close together. At least I hope it is, and I kind of expect that's what F1 and the FIA are sort of hoping will happen, because they come into effect next year. But obviously, we're sort of all kind of running with the same stuff we've got, and then we've got proper rule changes coming in 22, and
I think they're ramping up the caps on like 2023 as well, right? They're kind of
it's sort of it knocks down a bit for over the next few years, and then it sort of stabilizes, and then I think everyone sees where they are at that point. But I think I mean, it's hard to make a big call on this because they sort of brought in some not massive changes, but fairly significant ones in 2017, and Mercedes just railroaded through that. But normally we get a bit of a shake-up around those times, and from then we get like this second phase development race, because the first year of new technical and sometimes sporting regulations are teams sort of coming up with their first initial ideas, and then they come out on the track and everyone sort of looks at what everyone's done, and then we get this sort of secondary development race where everyone hones it in.
Yeah.
And right now we're kind of very much at the honed in point for our current set. So that development race is normally the incredibly costly part. So I think, hang on, I've lost track of the years. Yeah, through the mid-20s, I think we're going, hopefully, to see smaller teams be able to keep up at least, or come up with some crazy idea that work. How we kind of used to see classically, you could get a small team that had one crazy idea that really, really worked, and suddenly they were up amongst it.
Yeah.
So I think we might be able to see more of that, but it's a very tricky thing to call.
All right. Well, yeah, that's a good answer. I like that one. And then, so the next one, like, do you think that there was like a reason that it like took them this long to implement like a budget cap, or like I don't know if like they just didn't want to like do that for a while, or if now it's just because Mercedes is winning all the time. Like, all right, we got to do something about it.
I mean, a lot of it comes down to the teams. I mean, they tried to put one in 2009, 2010. I mean, the FIA were already there. I think you might have to look this up to the specifics. I think they tried to bring in a $40 million budget cap, 2009, 2010, and they had it all down. They were like, "This is what the rules are going to be," which is significantly smaller than the 145 I think they're bringing in for next year.
Yeah.
Again, just have to double check that figure. But at that time, the teams are kind of informally unionized because the Concord Agreement hadn't been signed, and they were sort of, fighting for a bigger stick of the pie and all that and stuff. And then that kind of collective power got kind of chiseled away by Bernie Ecclestone, just like doing backdoor deals one by one as he does. But around that time, they did bring in what was it called, like the resource restriction agreement or something like that, which is still a thing that plays out now. That's the thing that started the whole we're getting rid of testing in mid-season. You can only test a small amount of time each year. You can only use so many components each year. That you can only bring so many staff. You have to have a curfew on race weekends. It's that kind of thing that started well, exactly that kind of thing that we see today, that they've kind of tightened up in some areas, that just chilled everyone out a little bit and just made everything a bit smaller. But yeah, at the time, essentially, the big teams were using a lot of money to be competitive. They were throwing cash at, wind tunnel, CFD development, just eking out performance. And some of the small teams were very much up for this cost cap. And, essentially say, well, we can't compete with this. We don't have the cash. It would be good if we just limited throwing money at the situation, because F1 isn't a how much money do you have game. F1 is a how smart are you at developing cars game. Yeah. And some of the small teams didn't like it, because I think it's essentially that kind of aspirational thing that's very similar to how, I guess, a little political, but similar to how like poorer and maybe working class people will vote against putting higher taxes on rich people because they aspire to be those rich people one day and then don't want to be hammered by taxes when they get there. And I think it's quite similar. The small teams are like, well, we don't have much money now, but if we do better and get more sponsors and get more money, and eventually we'll be a big team, and then we don't want to have to like be hemmed in. It's that kind of thing. I think they thought it went against F1, which should be about just you doing whatever you can to create the best car, I think. So that kind of stalled things, right? It took a long while to sort of convince the teams collectively that they shouldn't be just spending so much money. And I think we're now at this point where it's very, very clear that the top teams, I mean, Mercedes and Ferrari are spending 4 or 5 times as much as Williams are.
Yeah.
Ferrari get more in prize money than Williams and Haas spend. It's like it's just so big. And now we've got, Williams nearly went under. They got bought, but they nearly went under. McLaren have sold their factory. Renault, as a car company, their profits tanked last year by about 95%. So F1's very clearly not immune to just completely collapsing if a few teams start to feel the pinch. So I think we got to a point where it was like very, very clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess kind of, I didn't write this question down, but you mentioning like F1 collapsing kind of made me think of this. Like, what do you think would happen if like 2 or 3 teams just had to like drop out of the sport? Like, do you think it would still continue with 7, or is there like a minimum number of teams required?
Well, the rules state that if you have to check this one as well. I think once we get down to 9 teams, it may be 8, but some of the teams will be forced to run 3 cars. So there's kind of an onus on the teams to make up the minimum number of cars essentially.
Okay.
And this they started talking about this again in 2008, 2009, because at that point there was the financial collapse, and just 3, 4, I think, but loads of big manufacturers left. Honda left, Ford left, Toyota left, and then everyone was starting to panic. It's like, well, what do we do? What do we do if all these cars left? Like, there's this massive worldwide financial collapse, and there's no guarantee that any big manufacturer will stick around, because F1 is hugely expensive, and they have to turn around to their shareholders and say, you have to justify just throwing hundreds of millions of pounds at this sport. So, but to answer your question, to an extent, they'll sort of fudge through it. I think they can rely on certain teams to hang around. But again, people like Mercedes, for a couple of years now, there's been a lot of talk of, no, well, they're going to stick around, or they're going to try and sell the team, even though they're massively successful and have this huge facility.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk of, it's unclear where the rumors come from. There's a lot of talk of them sort of being like, well, we achieved what we wanted to achieve. We spent a lot of money. We're cool. We want to invest now in future tech and things like Formula E and stuff, which is cheaper and where all the manufacturers are.
Yeah.
So there's no guarantees, but I think, we may get, if that happened, you'd get a period where teams are running more cars, and I therefore would have to like dramatically reduce the cost of entry, which it has dramatically increased by introducing this new rule that I think you need to put down a $200 million bond just to enter now, which is okay. But I think it would need to strip a lot of things back. It would probably need to change the engines and stuff as well, because they're so expensive at the moment. Even though they are great, they are very expensive, because we've seen things like, well, the WEC, DTM, like big manufacturers that were there for years and years and years have gone. They're just gone, and there's just like no big people left in those sports, and it's like, and now they're scrabbling to sort of change things up to try and encourage them back. So it's hard to say, but I think it would have to do something dramatic to make sure that momentum doesn't like kill it off.
All right, cool. All right, and yeah, for the next one, yeah, in some of your videos, like you've talked about like ways to balance the sport more. Like one of the more notable ones is like I think you called it the communist F1, where every driver gets to drive in every car.
Yeah.
I guess like another one would be like reverse grids. Like, do you think any of these would like have a chance of like working or being implemented? Like maybe not those extreme ones, but like more subtle ones.
Possibly. I don't think I think, even though I kind of really quite like the communist F1 one, where everyone gets to swap cars, and so all the teams get to go with all the drivers, and all the drivers get to go with all the teams, which would be really good at demonstrating just how good each driver and each car, each team is. That kind of blows apart the whole like commercial side of F1.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. I don't think we'll see it, but I think it's an interesting one. So I don't think we'll see something like that. And I think reverse. Okay, so qualifying, I think, is a really tricky beast, because on the one hand, by design, it makes the race more boring, because its entire output, say for like a crazy like rain affected qualifying or whatever, but what it does is it outputs the start of the race in pace order, so the fastest person is at the front, so you're automatically reducing the odds of them being overtaken or them not winning the race, which we all know. However, qualifying in itself is actually very exciting, like watching people go all out for one lap to try and get an extra tenth of a second and push it to the limit and stuff. That's very exciting, and everyone really likes that, and no one really wants to get rid of that. And to sort of square those two circles into something that works is really hard. And I think that's why there's a lot of pushback to changing qualifying, because actually qualifying right now works really well. It's not particularly artificial. It gets everyone out on track quite regularly, so there's plenty to see for the whole hour. and I think it's fairly fair in the way that you sort of the order that the grid is pretty much reflective of how people performed. So switching that around to have some kind of reverse grid thing, I think, has a lot of resistance within the sport, but not a lot of resistance from people like Liberty, who have made very clear signs that they are very focused on the entertainment part of the sport and are very willing to try bending the essence of Formula One to try and make something that's a bit more exciting and interesting to watch. And they pushed for some reverse grids this year, and the teams pushed back, and they are pushing very hard for it again for, I think they're saying, some races in 2021.
Okay.
So I think there's a chance, just by the sheer amount they're pushing, that we might see it. I don't know if it will stick. It's hard. I think just purely on Liberty's willpower alone, we might see that kind of thing. But I think the way to sort of fit, so the kind of reverse grids and stuff like that, I think is just a way of making the race more exciting. That's what they're trying to do. And I think the better way of fixing that is not with this kind of band-aid, essentially. It's a very dramatic band-aid, but just fixing the sport to allow more overtaking and racing to happen during the race. Allowing people to get side by side, allowing people to try different strategies, or making different tires work, or just allowing more variables to play out through the race, and in a way that isn't just rolling dice or artificially shuffling things up. But like, you could start on the third row of the grid, but you might go for a 2-stop race versus a 1-stop race and make that work, and drive your heart out on different sets of tires to make that work. And that's the thing that doesn't really happen at the moment, because everyone's kind of stuck behind each other because they can't overtake, and B, everyone kind of hones into this one optimum strategy. And ways of getting rid of that could be, binning practice, or binning almost all of practice, like the Friday, so they don't have a lot of data, so they have to kind of improvise a bit more. So something like that, I think maybe we could see. And I think that is something they've talked about. They haven't given a actual concrete plan, but as part of their sort of 2022 suite of rules, they are like, we're going to condense the weekend. We're going to like cut a lot of it back and make it more streamlined and interesting. And I think times when we've seen like wet Fridays or washed out Fridays, like we saw at Germany last weekend, and like we're going to see at Imola next weekend, when we don't have a Friday until, I think when that happens, we see Saturdays are more interesting and chaotic, and there's more mistakes, and there's more people having to work off their instincts and their skill, rather than feeding everything into a computer and understanding exactly what they should be doing on a Sunday. I think that kind of thing we can hone in.
All right.
I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but
yeah, I think that works. And yeah, I guess this one's kind of just like really just what do you think about it? But like, why do you think it's gotten, like, the sport's gotten so much more expensive, like, since like previous years? Like, it's just kind of like spiked, really, I think.
Yeah, I had a little think about this one, because it is an interesting. I mean, part of it, again, I think kind of like the cost cap thing. It isn't just a recent years thing. I think recent years, it's like you look at it now and you're like, whoa, that's out of control. I think kind of similar to that frog in a boiling pan analogy, which I've heard isn't actually true, but that idea that if you put a frog in a pan of boiling water, it jumps out because it's like, wow, that's boiling. But if you put a frog in a cold pan of water and heat it up, it'll just sit there until it boils. Which apparently isn't true, but it's a great analogy for so many things. But the last couple of decades, I think this has sort of been a problem that's just been brewing and brewing and brewing, due to this. It's an arms race. It's new technology, and it's this kind of just this fighting over like tiny fractions of development. So whereas like I don't know, up until like the late 70s, early 80s kind of time, your car development, your ingenuity would be like a team of experienced engineering people who would come up with great ideas and throw them on the car and see if they worked. And you could do all kinds of things. You could just put a massive wing on the car. You could put a fan on the back. You could put 6 wheels on it. You could. One team ran like 2 chassis stacked on top of each other. I think that was to get around a rule, to be honest. But but it was like it was very wacky races kind of thing. And now, because of the way the technical regulations are, everybody is free to develop as they wish. There's like you can come. It's not a spec series at all, but the box in which they're allowed to develop their cars is very, very small. So kind of what you've got now is just lots and lots and lots of people and computers and wind tunnel time and CFD time going into just testing and honing all these like tiny improvements to just EQ out a little further. And it's just essentially just plowing resources into developing something. It's not. Development doesn't come from like a small amount of people who are just really good at what they do. It's just like we'll just throw more money at the problem. And when I say money, I kind of mean people. And this kind of sort of bleeds into your next question. It's sort of about computerization a little bit, but which I may sort of end up segueing into. You were kind of limited in the old days because you would sort of come up with an idea and then you'd have to build the idea and then you'd have to like put it in a wind tunnel. You'd have to take it to a track and test the idea. And then there was a limit to what you could do. And so there was a limit to the amount of people you'd put at that problem. And now you've got factories working sort of 24 hours. They're just baking out parts on the autoclaves. They're running CFD models all the time. They could run hundreds of things at the same time and rinse through terabytes of data and just work things out. And for that, you need people on it. So you may have 30 people working on the front wing constantly, just all year round. Whereas before there would be no point in doing that because you just couldn't. you could. There's just not enough resources to actually make that thing happen. But now with like computerization and stuff, and just these massive factories and the way the sort of they've beefed up the production line, the development line. You're just constantly at it, and partly because they don't really have restrictions on that, which they kind of do now. They kind of the last few years we've had you can only work for a certain amount of hours per week on your wind tunnel and a certain amount of hours per week on your fluid dynamics modeling. I'm not quite sure how they monitor that, but let's just assume that's true. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same as like any industry really, in that you being in like a highly competitive environment, whether you work in like, I don't know, the finance sector, where you just hire this massive amount of computers to do all your sort of like finance and investment modeling, or whether you work in the, I don't know, the shipping industry where you like, or somewhere like Amazon where you just build these like massive things to stay ahead of the competition. It's kind of like that. It's just you throw resources at it and then hope that other people can't keep up with you.
All right, and then so for the next one, it's kind of, you'd mentioned it. It's about like the computerizing different areas of testing, and like such as like crash testing and that sort of thing, or like aerodynamic like wind tunnel testing, but on a computer. Like, do you think that could be like an effective way? Because at least, especially with crash testing, because like you'd have to like build the cars and crash it, and can't use that one anymore. You got to make a new one.
Yeah. I mean, that in particular is a sort of expensive part of what I'm. But I mean, I can't see that particular part of it ever happening. Having said that, the way technology ramps up and things we'll be able to do in 20 years, who knows? But because like material science is so complicated, and it's incredibly important to prove that what you've built can withstand the potential dangerous risks that the car may go through and what the driver may go through, and you have to like prove that materially. I don't think we would see a move to computerized crash testing. I think that would be a risky move. It might be a thing that could happen in the future. I think it would need to be proven on a smaller scale. I think they would need to, it may start with, I was going to say road cars, but it's like, again, putting cars on the road that are sort of, you may have to do things in road cars where you do digital tests and physical tests and have that proven for like 10 years that they sort of align and things get to that kind of point. I think it's a very complicated procedure because you've got hundreds, thousands of parts made of different materials interacting with each other under different stresses and having to like be confident that your model in the computer will match what will happen in real life. And I think the FIA, the teams and the drivers will take a hell of a lot of convincing that is enough to get someone in a car and put them on a track. In other aspects, in things like design, testing, I mean, we are in a point now where we only, in terms of testing, we do, I mean, next year we've got 3 days of testing total. I think we got no in-season testing. We've got 3 days of testing winter, which is like just, I've only been watching F1 for 20 years, but when I started, you'd have 10, 12 days testing in winter, and then you'd have like 20 days in the middle of the year, and then some private tests, and then a test at the end of the year. You'd have just like, and then for people like Ferrari would have their own track in their back garden that they go testing in just whenever they wanted. So, and being able to move that kind of stuff into the computer, into things like that, has helped tremendously with the confidence that the thing you have made will work in a certain way on the track. They're not, by the time they get to winter testing, they're kind of, honing it in. They're not putting the car on track and be like, wow, that car did not do what I thought it was going to. And in theory, because you're not building as many parts, and because you're not using the wind tunnel as much, and because you're not, shipping parts or transporting an entire team and those parts to a track, running the track, hiring the track, transport, you're not doing all of that stuff. In theory, you're saving a lot of money. But as I sort of talked about before, you can, there's no limit to how many computers you can buy, how many people you can hire, engineers, computer technicians, data analysts, to run these models, analyze these models, hone in your things, unrestricted. And obviously there's a limit because there's only so much you make back from F1, but in theory, you could just run thousands of people constantly on designing and testing these parts in a computer. So it actually kind of expands your envelope for how much you can spend and how much they are spending, because of how easy it is to like run everything concurrently and do 100 things at the same time. Previously, you may have had, you may have been doing some modeling and thought, okay, maybe the front wing should like this, maybe it should like this. And you come up with 3 models, you build them, you test them, and you go, okay, well, this is the kind of route to go. Now, before you even get to that stage, you can run 100 tweaks and variations, which takes a lot of people, which costs a lot of money, because these are not like, I don't want to be rude, but there are people with experience. There are people with like intense degrees and a lot of experience behind them who come with a hefty salary. So you're spending money. I think that's, again, where a lot of these savings will be made when the cost cap comes in. It's going to be people. It's going to be Mercedes downsizing their whatever, like, barge board team from 30 people to 8 people, or it's going to be like, and this isn't necessarily redundancies. This may be like, okay, we're going to move these people onto our sports car team or our Formula E team or into our road car department. I think they'll probably just shift them around. But in terms of the Formula One team, I think the money saving is going to be coming from shrinking teams who are running mostly computers, I think. So to answer your question in the broad sense, I think computerizing everything isn't necessarily cheaper, and probably has made things more expensive, which is partly why they do include things like CFD in there, how much they restrict operating hours. And again, for things like CFD, they are they have like tremendous supercomputers. I think at one point the Sauber F1 team had, I can't remember what his name was. It had like a cute name, like Robert or something. But they had like the second most powerful supercomputer in the world or something. It was just like, I think it was running their wind tunnel data. It was just absurd. So these things aren't aren't cheap. Yeah, I don't know. I rambled a bit. I don't know if that all added up to something that made sense.
No, I got it. All right. Well, yeah, that is all the questions I have for you. So, I guess if you wanted to take some time to, like, I guess, tell people about your channel, like, I don't know, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, like, yeah, I'm Stuart Taylor. I run a Formula One explainy animated shorts channel on YouTube under the name Chain Bear. It's some people like it. Yeah, that's me.
All right, well, cool. Sorry,
No, I just
oh, all right.
doing the British thing of just continuing to mumble syllables until I'm interrupted.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you again. Yeah, this was awesome. This will do great. Just what I needed.
Okay, good. I'm glad. I hope something in that waffle was useful and informative. Yeah, good luck with your wider thing.
Thank you.
Cheers.
All right. Yep. You have a good one.
And you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good. It's still the middle of the day for you, so you got.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Cheers, man.
Yep. See ya. Or probably not, but.
True.